The night my own son humiliated me in front of everyone, accusing me of wasting his money. I didn't argue or explain. I went silent. By morning, I made one calculated move that cut off everything he depended on, and as I walked away, I knew the moment he discovered it, nothing in his life would ever be the same again. Before I take you back to how it all started and how one careless sentence pushed everything into motion, do something small for me. Subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. It helps these stories travel further than you think. I never imagined my life would arrive at that moment. For decades, I was the kind of man who worked quietly, consistently, without applause. I built my career with my hands and my mind, never cutting corners, never asking for favors. I raised my son the same way: discipline, responsibility, independence. I didn't spoil him, but I never let him lack. There was always food on the table, clothes on his back, and a quiet assurance that his father would handle whatever storm came next. I never borrowed from him, never leaned on him financially, never asked for a single dollar. So when I retired earlier than most men my age, it wasn't because I'd failed or been forced out. It was because I'd already given 40 years of my life to a company I'd built from nothing. Not the kind that made headlines, not the kind that attracted flashy investors, just a small, steady tech firm that paid its bills, paid its people, and gave me security. When I sold it, I cleared every debt, organized every account, and made sure I'd never be a burden to anyone, especially not my own son. I could have lived anywhere. I had the means. But when he suggested I stay with him temporarily while his condominium was being renovated, I believed him. He said it would only be for a short time. I thought it might be good for us. A chance to close the distance that had grown over the years when work consumed me and fatherhood happened between deadlines. I told myself we'd finally talk, share meals, rebuild something that had gone quiet. So I packed light: 2 suitcases, clothes, a box of old books I couldn't part with, a small tin filled with photographs, some faded, some sharp enough to sting when I looked too long. I didn't bring furniture. I didn't bring anything that would claim space. I didn't want to impose. I wanted to fit quietly into his life, not weigh it down. From the first day, I paid my way. I bought my own groceries without being asked. When I went shopping, I picked up extras: milk, bread, fruit, things for the house. I covered my share of the utilities without discussion. I kept my room spotless. I washed dishes immediately. I left no trace of inconvenience behind me. I thought that was what decent people did. But it didn't take long to realize I wasn't living with my son. I was existing in a space he had already decided I didn't belong in. At first, I made excuses for him. We hadn't lived together in decades. Adjustment took time. Maybe his silence was stress. Maybe his short answers were exhaustion. Maybe the way he avoided eating with me was just his schedule. I wanted to believe blood still meant something. But slowly, the signs stacked up. Conversations shortened. Eye contact vanished. I'd sit in the living room reading, and he'd walk in, scan the space like he was checking for damage, then leave without a word. When he talked to friends on the phone, his voice was light, relaxed, the boy I remembered. The second he noticed I could hear, his tone flattened, like warmth had been switched off. Meals together disappeared. Sometimes I cooked, hoping food might bridge what word didn't. Once, I made his favorite, roast chicken with lemon and rosemary, the same way I used it when he was young. He came home, glanced at it, and said, "You didn't need to do all that. I'm not hungry." Then he microwaved something frozen and ate alone. I sat there while the chicken cooled. The skin lost its crisp. The room lost its purpose. It wasn't hostility. That would have been easy to confront. It was indifference, the kind that tells you you're invisible. So I tried harder to stay out of the way. I spent more time outside, walking through parks, sitting in libraries, drinking coffee in small cafes just to avoid being under his feet. I told myself it was temporary, that once his renovation was finished, he'd look back and realize it hadn't been so bad having me there. But in the quiet moments, alone in that spare room, a colder truth began to form. I wasn't a guest. I wasn't family. I was an easy target. Someone older. Someone who wouldn't push back. Someone he assumed would tolerate anything just to keep a roof overhead. What he didn't realize was that every small dismissal was sharpening my awareness. It started with little things. My coffee jar emptied faster than it should have. Milk disappeared. I knew I wasn't using it. I didn't ask where it went. I already knew. Then my chair vanished, moved near his desk because he needed extra seating. I didn't argue. I sat somewhere else. That was the test. He wanted to see if I'd give it up. I did. The thermostat became another game. At night, the temperature dropped so low I could see my breath in the morning. I turned it up. The next night, it was cold again. This wasn't about saving money. It was about control. In the kitchen, my cups were moved to the highest shelf. My favorite pan disappeared, then returned scratched. The television remote vanished whenever I entered the room. If I walked in while he was watching something enjoyable, the channel changed instantly to something dull. Silence followed me like a shadow. When guests came over, he didn't call me his father. He used my name. Once, someone asked how long I'd be staying. He said, until he figures something out. That sentence landed harder than anything else. I had helped him for years, supported him when no one else did. Now I was figuring something out. On my birthday, he said nothing. No text. No acknowledgement. I sat in my room looking at old photos of him as a child, holding a toy I'd worked overtime to buy. I had believed love like that lasted. I was wrong. Each small act wasn't random. They were tests. He was conditioning me, shrinking my space so that when he made his real move, I would resist. What he didn't see was that these games weren't weakening me. They were giving me time. And when the moment finally came, I would be ready. That moment arrived on a Saturday afternoon, in a backyard filled with smoke from the grill and voices from people who thought they knew us. Neighbors, friends, casual laughter. I sat quietly at a corner table, keeping my distance. When I heard they were running low on food, I stood and offered to pick up more. My treat. Before I took another step, his voice cut through everything. Loud, deliberate, meant to be heard. Stop wasting my money. The yard went silent. He didn't look embarrassed. He smirked, held his drink like nothing was wrong. People looked away. Conversations died mid-sentence. I didn't respond. I sat back down. And in that moment, while everyone avoided my eyes, something inside me settled. The next morning, I would begin doing exactly what he never expected. The morning after the barbecue didn't begin with shouting or confrontation. It began with silence, the heavy, deliberate kind that presses against your chest before you even open your eyes. I woke earlier than usual, my body trained by decades of routine. For a moment, I lay still listening. No movement upstairs. No music. No footsteps. Just the low hum of the refrigerator through the wall. I went to the kitchen to make coffee. That's when I saw the lock. It was small, silver, freshly installed on the pantry door, catching the light like it wanted to be noticed. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at it as if it might disappear if I waited long enough. Then I saw the note on the refrigerator, written in familiar, sharp handwriting. Stay out of the kitchen after 8. Need to keep things organized. Organized. That was his word for exclusion. I opened the fridge. The milk was almost gone. I knew I hadn't touched most of it. The bread was missing. The shelves were bare except for a box of crackers I bought days earlier. I closed the door slowly, not because I was angry. Anger would have given him something. But because I was confirming what I already knew. This wasn't accidental. That night, when the house went quiet, I tested it. At 10 o'clock, I walked into the kitchen. The pantry was locked. Solid. Final. The kitchen, the center of any home, had been closed to me like I was an unwanted guest overstaying his welcome. I returned to my room with tea and crackers and ate in silence, the same silence that had followed me for months. Over the next few days, the changes multiplied. The coffee maker was moved out of reach. The sugar jar vanished. The television remote disappeared entirely. When I asked, he shrugged and said, "It's probably somewhere." We both knew where it was. It was never about food or coffee. or television. It was about reminding me I had no authority here. But I didn't argue. I didn't complain. I didn't even look surprised. I kept my voice neutral, polite, almost cheerful. That was important, because the moment he saw resistance, he might start watching me more closely, and I needed him comfortable. You see, while he was locking doors and hiding objects, he had forgotten something important. Years ago, when I sold my business, I didn't close every account. There was one joint account left open for convenience, initially for clearing final expenses. Over time, my son began using it for a startup. Vendors, rent, supplies. It became routine. And then it became assumption. My name never came off that account. Legally, every cent in it belonged to me as much as it belonged to him. He never asked to close it because he believed I'd forgotten about it, that I didn't understand, that I didn't care. He was wrong. I checked that account once a year, quietly, just to see. And every time, I noticed the same pattern. Money in, money out, more out than in. No real savings. No long-term planning. Flash over foundation. That night, after the pantry lock, I sat on my bed with my laptop and logged in. The balance stared back at me. Lower than last year, but still substantial. I scrolled through transactions. Thousands spent in weeks. Custom car parts. Luxury watches. Weekend trips. None of it essential. None of it restrained. And then his voice replayed in my head. Stop wasting my money. My money. I closed the laptop and sat still. My hands didn't shake. My heart didn't race. What I felt wasn't rage. It was clarity, because in that moment, I understood something he never would until it was too late. Real control isn't noise. It's access. I slept better that night than I had in months. The next morning, I woke before dawn. The house was quiet in the way it only is when someone else believes a day will be ordinary. I made tea and sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I had eaten crackers like a child the night before. I opened the laptop again. This time, I went through everything slowly. $1,800 for a custom exhaust system. $600 at a luxury watch boutique. $4,200 for flights and hotels. Nothing about survival. Everything about image. The truth settled in fully then. The only reason he lived like this was because I had allowed it. My silence had been permission. My patience had funded his arrogance. I thought about the thermostat battles. The hidden remote. The note on the fridge. The way his friends looked away when he embarrassed me. And I realized something important. This wasn't about retaliation. It was about balance. I didn't call him. I didn't warn him. I didn't ask for explanations. Courtesy had never been extended to me, so I owed none in return. I called the bank. I didn't pace. I didn't rehearse. I gave my information, verified my identity, and said calmly that I wanted to remove one name from the account. No, I didn't need his consent. Yes, I understood the process. When the representative confirmed my authority, something loosened in my chest. Not relief, something sharper, something final. After the call ended, I went deeper. Shared utilities, automatic payments, subscriptions, transfers, click, cancel, secure. I wasn't sloppy. I didn't take more than what was mine. I simply closed doors that had been left open too long. Then came the house. My name was on the deed, always had been. But over the years, I'd let him treat it like his stage, his space, his rules. Renovations I didn't ask for. Rearrangements I tolerated. People I didn't invite. Patience had run its course. I called the real estate agent I'd spoken to months earlier. The one I hadn't had the nerve to commit to. I'm ready, I said. There was no hesitation this time. By mid-morning, I was pulling boxes from the garage. Not for my things. For his. Clothes. Electronics. Framed photos. Trophies from events I'd never been invited to. I didn't fold carefully. I didn't pack gently. These weren't keepsakes. They were reminders. I carried them to the curb in full view of the neighbors. I wanted them to see. Let him explain later. Room by room, the house grew lighter. His favorite mug. Gone. His razor. Gone. Mail stacked neatly. soon to be redirected. Every drawer emptied felt like reclaimed territory. When the locksmith arrived, I didn't explain. I just asked him to change everything. Front door, back door, garage. The drill echoed through the house like punctuation at the end of a long sentence. By late afternoon, I sat at the kitchen table again. The house was quiet, but this time, the quiet belonged to me. I didn't message him. I didn't leave a note. The locks would do the talking. And when his car finally pulled into the driveway that evening, fast and impatient, I stayed where I was, hands around a glass of water, waiting. The sound of his key failing in the lock told me everything. I didn't move when the key scraped uselessly against the lock. I didn't even look toward the door. I sat at the kitchen table, fingers wrapped around the cool glass, listening as confusion turned into irritation on the other side. The handle rattled. Once, twice, then harder. He tried again, slower this time, like force might fix what disbelief couldn't. Nothing. The knocking came next. Not polite, not patient. Sharp blows that echoed down the hallway. I counted them without meaning to. 5. A pause. 3 more, heavier. I imagined his face. Not panic yet, just calculation. He was trying to figure out how much of this was real. I didn't answer. He moved to the side door, then the back. Same results. Same locked silence. I stayed seated, breathing evenly. I'd waited months for this moment without knowing it, and now that it had arrived, there was no rush. The house felt different with him on the outside. Larger, quieter, as if it had exhaled. The knocking stopped. I heard his footsteps retreat. The car door slam. The engine roared to life far more aggressively than necessary. Tires bit into the driveway as he reversed too fast, then disappeared down the street. I didn't mistake that silence for surrender. Men like him don't collapse at locked doors. They regroup. They find angles. They look for leverage. So I didn't waste time. I called my lawyer. I told her everything. The joint accounts. The house. The lockout. I expected questions, hesitation, maybe a warning to slow down. Instead, she listened quietly, then said, "You did the right thing calling when you did." By the afternoon, she'd sent drafts, clean, precise, airtight, notices, filings, protections. I read every word, not because I doubted her, but because I wanted to understand exactly where the ground now stood. I signed everything digitally and sent it back without hesitation. 2 days later, his response arrived the way I expected. Not in person, not with accountability, but through an attorney's letter thick with accusation and performance. It painted me as unstable, reckless, confused, a man acting out of emotion rather than reason. I read it twice, not because it hurt, but because I wanted to recognize the pattern. This was his world. Control the story before anyone could check the facts. Make enough noise that truth got buried under tone. I didn't respond. My lawyer did. 1 page. Calm. Every claim contested. Nothing conceded. That silence enraged him more than any argument ever could. The call started soon after. Unknown numbers. Blocked IDs. Voicemails layered with forced calm and implied concern. He spoke slowly, carefully, like he was explaining something obvious to someone unreasonable. I deleted them without listening all the way through. I wasn't interested in being managed anymore. The financial ripples hit faster than I expected. The shared credit line I'd closed left him scrambling. Payments bounced. Vendors called. Subscriptions failed. The automatic transfers he'd relied on like clockwork were gone. He tried to reroute them, but there was nothing left to reroute from. Friends stopped inviting him places. Whether they believed his version of events or not didn't matter. Either way, association with chaos has a cost. The invitations dried up quietly without announcement. I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel satisfaction the way movies suggest you should. There was no surge of triumph, no dramatic sense of victory. What I felt was lighter, like setting down a heavy bag you didn't realize you'd been carrying for years. One morning, I walked through the house and realized there was no trace of him left. Not in the closets, not in the drawers, not even in the air. The silence was different now. Not tense. Not waiting for the next conflict. Just quiet. Mike, quiet. That's when I understood something important. The real shift hadn't happened the day I changed the locks. It happened weeks later, in those calm mornings when I expected regret and found none. I waited for a crash, some emotional backlash that would make me question everything. It never came. People asked if I missed him. They asked carefully, the way people do when they're hoping you'll admit weakness, so they can relay it back as proof you're still reachable. I gave them nothing. Not because I was hiding pain, but because there was nothing to reveal. The absence wasn't a wound. It was a healed scar. He tried one last angle. Messages about clearing the air. About one final conversation. About closure. I recognized the tactic immediately. Closure wasn't what he wanted. He wanted access. One reply. One opening. Something he could expand into control again. I ignored them. The days grew simpler. Bills were easier to manage. The calendar emptied. I noticed how much mental space I'd been surrendering without realizing it. How every decision had once been filtered through how he might react. Now, there was no filter. I rebuilt my routine quietly. Morning walks. Coffee in the same chair. Not because I needed structure to survive, but because I wanted to prove to myself that my rhythm no longer depended on someone else's approval. The gossip faded. It always does. People lose interest when there are no new details to chew on. My name disappeared from conversations, replaced by someone else's drama. That suited me just fine. When I saw him again, it wasn't planned. It was at a grocery store near the self-checkout. He froze when he noticed me, clearly expecting something. A look, a nod, anger, anything. I gave him nothing. I scanned my items, bagged them, and walked out. That silence said more than words ever could. From then on, it felt like his presence had shifted into a different orbit. I knew he still existed somewhere, still working, still telling his version of events. But it no longer touched me. Whatever circles he moved in now didn't intersect with mine. The house became mine in ways paperwork alone could never capture. I rearranged furniture. Painted over walls he'd insisted were fine. Replaced fixtures he refused to upgrade. It wasn't about erasing him. It was about removing his fingerprints from my life. There's a freedom that comes when you stop bracing for someone else's reaction. The moment I realized I was no longer adjusting my choices around his opinion was the moment I knew it was truly over. Not with a bang, with a quiet certainty. And that certainty didn't fade. It deepened. The silence didn't arrive all at once. It spread slowly, like dusk filling a room where the lights had been left off for too long. At first, it was noticeable in small ways. The phone stayed still on the table for hours at a time. No vibrations. No unknown numbers lighting up the screen. The mailbox held nothing with his name on it anymore. Even the house itself seemed to settle, as if it no longer had a brace for impact. I hadn't expected that. For years, even before he moved in, my life had been punctuated by his demands. Questions that weren't really questions. Statements disguised as requests. Opinions delivered like instructions. I'd grown so used to that constant pressure that when it vanished, my mind kept waiting for it to return. It was like standing on a dock after stepping off a boat. Your body still swaying even though the ground beneath you was solid. The first week after the lockout, I moved through my days cautiously, as if he might suddenly appear in the doorway, arms crossed, ready to reclaim space I'd finally taken back. But he didn't, and the longer he stayed gone, the more I realized how deeply his presence had shaped my behavior. I noticed it one morning while making breakfast. I reached for a pan and paused, instinctively calculating whether it would bother him. The thought startled me. He wasn't there, hadn't been for days. Yet my body still remembered how to shrink. That realization angered me more than the barbecue ever had. Not the anger that makes you shout, but the kind that sharpens your awareness. The kind that shows you how much ground you've lost without realizing it. I stood there in the kitchen, holding that pan, and understood that what I was reclaiming wasn't just space or money or authority. It was myself. So I started deliberately undoing habits I'd built around him. I turned the thermostat to a comfortable temperature and left it there. I cooked when I wanted, as much as I wanted, and ate at the table instead of in my room. I left books open on the coffee table. I watched what I wanted on television, without worrying about someone changing the channel the moment I walked in. Each small act felt rebellious, even though no one was there to rebel against. That's when I knew how deeply the imbalance had run. The next letter from his lawyer arrived a week later. Thinner this time, less theatrical, still aggressive, but the edges were dulled. I read it carefully, line by line, noting the shift in tone. Less certainty, more implication. He was running out of leverage, and it showed. My lawyer responded again, just as briefly, just as firmly. I never saw her flinch. That steadiness was a comfort I hadn't known I needed. For so long, I've been the one steadying others. Now, someone else was holding the line for me. Word traveled, as it always does. A neighbor stopped me one afternoon while I was checking the mail, asked casually if everything was okay between me and my son. I smiled politely and said I was doing just fine. That answer seemed to unsettle her more than any dramatic confession would have. People are uncomfortable with calm when they expect chaos. I kept my explanations minimal, not out of secrecy, but out of self-respect. My life wasn't a spectacle to be narrated for entertainment. Those who needed to know already did. The rest could wonder, and wonder they did. I could feel it when I walked down the street. The glances that lingered a moment too long. The sudden politeness from people who used to greet me with indifference. It wasn't that they'd chosen sides. It was that the story they quietly accepted had cracked, and no one likes realizing they might have been wrong. Inside the house, things continued to change. I tackled projects I'd put off for years. Fixed a loose step on the back porch. Replaced a flickering light fixture in the hallway. Painted over a wall he'd insisted stayed dark because it matched his taste. With each improvement, the house felt less like a shared territory and more like a home again. One afternoon, while sorting through old paperwork, I came across a folder labeled with his name. Inside were receipts, records, reminders of times I'd helped him financially when he was younger. College fees, emergency transfers, rent deposits. I sat there for a long time, staring at those pages, not with regret, with clarity. I realized that my support had never been the problem. The problem was that I'd never set an end date. I'd allowed help to turn into expectation, and expectation to harden into entitlement. By the time I noticed, it had already shaped the way he saw me, not as a father, as a resource. That understanding was painful, but it was also freeing. It meant the failure wasn't personal. It was structural, and structures can be dismantled. The calls resumed briefly after that. Fewer this time, more frantic. He left one voicemail where the calm finally cracked. Not anger, not apology, panic. I listened to the first few seconds, then deleted it. I wasn't interested in being his safety net again. Weeks passed, then months. The legal matters moved forward quietly. No dramatic courtroom scenes. Just paperwork, confirmation, finality. The house listing went live, and offers began to come in. I took my time reviewing them, not because I was hesitant, but because I wanted to choose deliberately. This was my life now. Deliberate. During that period, something unexpected happened. I started sleeping better. Deep, uninterrupted sleep. The kind you don't realize you've been missing until it returns. I woke up without tension in my shoulders, without that faint dread that had once hovered at the edge of every morning. I started noticing things again. The way sunlight moved across the living room in the afternoon. The sound of birds in the early morning. Small details that had been drowned out by years of low-grade stress. One evening, as I sat on the back porch with a cup of coffee, I realized I hadn't thought about him all day. Not once. That was the moment I understood the true shape of the silence. It wasn't empty. It was spacious. It gave me room to exist without justification. When I finally sold the house, I didn't feel sadness. I felt completion. I packed my belongings carefully this time, not to be light on someone else's life, but to honor my own. I kept the books, the photographs, the small things that mattered. On moving day, I stood in the empty living room one last time. The walls were bare, the floors clean. There was no echo of conflict left, no residue of tension, just a quiet that felt earned. I locked the door behind me and didn't look back. The new place was smaller, quieter, and entirely mine. No shared history, no expectations, no unspoken rules. I arranged it slowly, thoughtfully, choosing where each piece belonged. Every decision felt like a statement. This is how I live now. Occasionally, someone would mention him in passing, a mutual acquaintance, a distant relative. I listened politely, then changed the subject, not because it hurt, but because it no longer mattered. He had become a chapter I'd already finished reading. I knew, somewhere, he was still telling his version of the story, casting himself as a victim, explaining away his choices. People like him need an audience. But I wasn't listening anymore, and without that, his words lost their power. The silence held. It held through holidays, through birthdays, through moments when years ago I would have reached out of habit or obligation. Each time I chose not to, not out of spite, but out of alignment. My life finally matched my boundaries. And in that alignment, I found something I hadn't expected at this stage of my life. Peace, not the fragile kind that depends on others behaving well. The solid kind that comes from knowing exactly where you stand and refusing to move from it. That peace didn't make me softer. It made me steady. And that steadiness would matter more than I realized. Because although the loud part of the conflict was over, the consequences were still unfolding. Quietly, inevitably, on his side of the door he could no longer open. Time has a way of revealing consequences without announcing them. They don't arrive all at once, and they don't ask for permission. They simply begin to show themselves in places you weren't looking. For me, that meant quiet days unfolding into quieter weeks, while somewhere else, far from my new routines, the weight of what I would draw on began pressing down on my son's life. I didn't hear about it directly at first. That was the difference now. Before, information flowed toward me, because I was expected to fix things. Now, it reached me only if it slipped through someone else's loose mouth or arrived by accident. That distance gave me perspective I'd never had before. The first sign came from an old acquaintance who ran into me at a cafe one afternoon. We exchanged pleasantries, talked about nothing in particular, and just as we were about to part, he hesitated. People always hesitate before crossing into territory they know might be sensitive. I heard things are complicated for him, he said carefully. I nodded once. Not agreement. Not denial. Just acknowledgement. He seemed relieved I didn't ask for details. People like to unload stories, but only if you invite them to. I didn't. I paid for my coffee and left, feeling oddly untouched by the information. Whatever complications were unfolding, they were no longer mine to manage. Over the next few months, similar fragments reached me. A missed payment here. A partnership that quietly dissolved there. An apartment he'd been forced to leave sooner than expected. None of it dramatic enough to make headlines. But together, they formed a pattern. The kind you don't see until you step back. Without the accounts I closed, his margins vanished. Without the house as a base, his stability cracked. Without me smoothing things over behind the scenes, every misstep landed exactly where it should. That wasn't cruelty. That was gravity. I thought back to how often I'd softened the landing for him in the past. Paid something late. Covered something quietly. Fixed problems before they reached his doorstep. At the time, I called it support. Now, I saw it for what it had been. Insulation from consequence. Remove the insulation, and reality does what it always does. The longer the silence stretched between us, the more I noticed how different my own days felt. I had energy again, not the frantic energy of urgency, but the steady kind that comes from not carrying someone else's chaos. I took on small projects, learned new habits, even entertained ideas I'd shelved years earlier because they didn't fit into the version of my life that revolved around him. One of those ideas was travel. Not escape, just movement. A change of scenery without the weight of obligation. I booked a short trip, Nothing extravagant, just enough to remind myself that I could go somewhere and answer to no one about it. Standing in an unfamiliar place, watching people pass by who knew nothing about my history, I felt something loosen inside me. Not relief exactly, more like confirmation. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. When I returned, there was a letter waiting for me. Not from him, from his attorney. It was shorter than the last one, less accusatory, more procedural. Request for information I no longer had an obligation to provide. Questions framed politely, like civility, might coax me back into engagement. I forwarded it to my lawyer and didn't think about it again. That was another change I noticed. How quickly things moved out of my mind once I decided they didn't belong there. For years, I carried unresolved tension like background noise. Now my thoughts had room to move. The next time I heard directly from my son wasn't through a call or a letter. It was through someone else's concern. A distant relative reached out, asking if I considered talking to him. Just once. Apparently, things were really hard for him now. I listened without interrupting. Then I said no. Not angrily. Not defensively. Just no. That answer surprised them. It surprised me too, a little. In the past, I would have justified it, explained myself, softened the refusal with reassurance. This time, I didn't. I understood something I hadn't before. Explanations are invitations, and I wasn't inviting anyone back into that space. After that, the requests slowed. Life settled into a rhythm I hadn't known in decades. Mornings were slow. Evenings were calm. I read more, thought more, spoke less. When people asked how I was doing, I answered honestly. I'm well. Not fine. Not managing. Well, there were moments, rare ones, when memories surfaced unexpectedly. A sound, a smell, a phrase that reminded me of him as a child, before entitlement hardened into expectation. Those moments carried a twinge of sadness, but it passed quickly. Grief doesn't demand permanence when you don't feed it. What stayed was clarity. I could see now how the imbalance had grown gradually. How my role had shifted from parent to provider to obstacle. How my silence had been interpreted as consent. It wasn't that I'd failed him by setting boundaries too late. It was that I'd finally set them at all. I learned that boundaries don't erase love. They reveal its limits. One evening, while organizing paperwork, I found an old notebook filled with ideas I'd once had for my business. Projects I'd postponed, improvements I'd never implemented because something else always demanded my attention. I flipped through the pages, surprised by how relevant many of those ideas still were. I didn't revive the company. That chapter was closed. But I did consult, advise, share knowledge on my terms. It wasn't about income. I didn't need it. It was about engagement, about using what I knew without surrendering my autonomy. That balance felt right. As for my son, the fragments of information grew quieter over time. His world narrowed, not because I willed it to, but because it was built on borrowed stability. When that stability was reclaimed, what remained had to stand on its own. Some structures don't. I don't know exactly when he realized there would be no return. There was no dramatic moment where he acknowledged it out loud. People like him rarely do. They simply stop reaching when every attempt meets the same unyielding boundary. Silence, again, did the work. Years from now, someone might ask me if I regret how things ended. I've thought about that question, turn it over carefully, and come to the same answer every time. I don't regret protecting my life. I regret waiting so long to do it, because in the space that followed, I found something I hadn't known I was missing. Not revenge. Not vindication. Ownership. Ownership of my time. My peace. My future. And once you taste that kind of ownership, you don't give it back. The money he accused me of wasting, that money is still here. It pays for warmth, for freedom, for mornings that begin without dread and nights that end without tension. It supports a life built deliberately, not extracted quietly by someone who mistook patience for weakness. The story didn't end with shouting or apologies. It didn't need to. It ended the moment I stopped participating in a version of myself that allowed disrespect to live rent-free in my life. And everything that followed was simply the natural result of that choice. The first real attempt to pull me back didn't come with anger or accusation. It came wrapped in concern. That was always his preferred disguise when brute force failed. Concern sounds reasonable. It invites dialogue. It suggests maturity. And for a long time, it worked on me. It didn't anymore. I noticed a shift when mutual contacts began reaching out again, one by one, always cautiously, always with the same careful tone. They didn't say his name at first. They talked about family, about time, about how life is short. Those phrases floated in the air like neutral facts, but they were never neutral. They were tools. I listened politely. I let them speak. Then I thanked them and changed the subject. Each time, I felt steadier. What surprised me wasn't his persistence. I'd expected that. What surprised me was how predictable the pattern was once I stepped outside it. First came silence, then pressure through intermediaries, then the reframing of history. He was following a script he'd been perfecting for years, counting on familiarity to do the work for him. It didn't. One afternoon, I received a message from a number I didn't recognize. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't apologetic. It was almost casual. "Can we talk?" Just to clear the air. I stared at the screen for a long moment, not because I was tempted, but because I was curious. Curious about how such a simple sentence had once held so much power over me. I didn't reply. I didn't block the number either. I simply let it sit unanswered until it faded into the background noise of life. That silence unsettled him more than a refusal ever could. The next message came a week later. Longer this time. More reflective. He spoke about misunderstandings, about stress, about how things had gotten out of hand. He never mentioned the lock on the pantry, never mentioned the barbecue, never mentioned the words that had cut deeper than he knew. Responsibility was carefully avoided. I deleted the message. After that, the tone shifted again. This time, urgency crept in. Practical concerns surfaced. He hinted at financial strain, at instability, at how things would be easier if we could just talk things through. That was the moment I understood something essential. He didn't miss me. He missed what I provided. Once I saw that clearly, there was no confusion left to resolve. The attempts didn't stop immediately. They escalated briefly, as they often do when someone senses a door closing permanently. More messages, different messengers. A sudden emphasis on shared memories, as if nostalgia could substitute for accountability. It didn't work. I'd spent enough time examining my own role in the past to recognize manipulation when it appeared. I wasn't angry about it anymore. I wasn't offended. I was simply done participating. Meanwhile, my own life continued expanding in quiet ways. I took on more consulting work, not because I needed income, but because I enjoyed the challenge. I chose projects selectively, worked with people who respected my boundaries, and walked away the moment something felt off. That was another lesson I'd learned too late, but applied diligently now. I redecorated my new place slowly, deliberately. Each piece of furniture was chosen because it suited me, not because it accommodated someone else's preferences. I hosted small gatherings, inviting only those who added something positive to space. No obligation, no guilt, just intention. The contrast between my current life and the one I'd left behind grew starker with time. One evening, while organizing old files, I came across a series of emails from years earlier, requests from my son framed as updates. Reading them now with distance, I could see how often those messages had assumed my involvement without asking. How often I complied, without questioning whether it was appropriate. That realization didn't hurt. It clarified. I hadn't been overly generous. I'd been insufficiently firm. And firmness, I'd learned, isn't cruelty. It's clarity. As months passed, his outreach dwindled. Not because he'd accepted the situation, but because the returns on effort had dropped to zero. People eventually stopped knocking when no one answers. The last message I received from him was different. Shorter, less polished. It didn't ask to talk. It didn't offer reconciliation. It simply stated that he was struggling and didn't know what else to do. I read it once. Then I put the phone down and went for a walk. That decision might sound cold to someone who hasn't lived inside the story. But it wasn't indifference that guided me. It was understanding. I understood exactly what would happen if I responded. One conversation would turn into two. Two into expectations. Expectations into demands. The cycle will begin again, disguised as healing. I wasn't interested in restarting a loop I'd finally escaped. On that walk, I thought about the version of myself that would have rushed to help without question. That man had believed sacrifice was the same as love. I knew better now. Love without boundaries becomes resentment. And resentment poisons everything it touches. When I returned home, I felt calm, grounded, certain. I never replied. After that, the silence settled in more deeply than before. Not just between us, but around me. It wasn't empty. It was full. Full of choice, full of space, full of the kind of peace that doesn't need validation. Occasionally, I'd hear indirect updates through distant channels. A job lost. A move postponed. Plans unraveling. I didn't seek out the information, but I didn't block it either. I accepted it as background noise, no more significant than weather reports from a city I no longer lived in. There was no satisfaction in hearing about his difficulties. Just confirmation. Confirmation that the support I'd withdrawn had been propping up something unsustainable. And that wasn't my fault. The most profound change came quietly one afternoon, when I realized I no longer felt the urge to explain myself to anyone. Not friends. Not relatives. Not strangers who thought they understood the situation. I didn't need to justify my boundaries. They justified themselves. The longer I lived this way, the more obvious it became how much of my identity had once been shaped by reaction. Responding. Accommodating. Adjusting. Now, my actions originated from intention instead. That shift affected everything. I spoke more deliberately, listened more selectively, chose my battles carefully, which meant choosing almost none at all. Conflict requires engagement. Silence, when used intentionally, dissolves it. I began to see the past differently, too. Not as a series of mistakes, but as a gradual lesson I needed time to learn. I didn't shame myself for the years I'd spent accommodating disrespect. I acknowledged them, then moved forward. That self-compassion mattered more than any external resolution ever could. As another year passed, it became clear that the chapter was truly closed. No more messages. No more intermediaries. No more quiet attempts to reestablish contact. He had finally accepted what I'd known for a long time. The door wasn't locked temporarily. It was closed by design. And I wasn't standing on the other side, waiting for it to open. I was already elsewhere, living a life that no longer required me to brace for impact or apologize for taking up space. That realization settled into me like something permanent, and with it came a final truth I carried forward. Sometimes, the strongest response isn't confrontation or explanation. It's withdrawal, not as punishment, but as preservation. I hadn't taken anything from him. I'd taken myself back. The absence became official the day I realized an entire season had passed without his name crossing my mind. Not in irritation, not in worry, not even in memory. Spring had arrived quietly. Trees outside my window filled in with green. Birds returned to the same branches they always did. And the city adjusted its pace without asking my opinion. Life, it turned out, didn't pause for unresolved relationships. It simply continued, steady, indifferent, honest. That was when I understood something important. The silence between us wasn't temporary anymore. It had matured into something permanent. The finality didn't come from a dramatic declaration or a legal document. It came from repetition. Day after day of choosing not to engage. Week after week of realizing nothing was missing. Month after month of building a life that no longer had gaps shaped like him. People often imagine endings as sharp moments. Doors slammed, words spoken that can't be taken back. But the real ending had already happened. It was happening every morning I woke up without tension. Every evening I went to bed without rehearsing conversations I didn't want to have. Every time my phone stayed silent, and I felt relieved instead of anxious. That's when silence stops being an absence and becomes a structure. I began to notice how much stronger I felt in my own presence. Decisions came easier, not because choices were simpler, but because I no longer had to anticipate interference. I could plan weeks ahead without factoring in someone else's emergencies. I could spend money without wondering if I'd need to rescue someone later. I could say yes to opportunities without bracing for guilt. That freedom changed the way I saw everything. One afternoon, I ran into someone who used to know us both. The conversation stayed surface level until they hesitated, then asked, "Do you think you'll ever talk again?" The question didn't offend me. It didn't even surprise me. People ask questions that make sense within their own emotional framework. They assume connection must be restored eventually, because that's what they would do. I answered honestly, "I don't think so." There was no bitterness in my voice. No sadness. Just clarity. They nodded slowly, unsure how to respond. Silence makes people uncomfortable when they expect drama. I excused myself and walked away, feeling lighter for having spoken the truth without needing to defend it. That truth settled deeper over time. I began to reflect, not on what he'd done, but on how I'd changed. The version of me who once absorbed disrespect quietly no longer existed. That wasn't something I'd forced. It had dissolved naturally once I stopped feeding it. I saw it in small moments. When someone spoke dismissively to me, I addressed it immediately instead of letting it slide. When a situation felt one-sided, I stepped back instead of overextending. When someone crossed a line, I didn't rationalize it away. These weren't reactions. They were defaults. I realized then how deeply my relationship with my son had trained me to tolerate imbalance. I'd learned patience so thoroughly that it had turned into self-erasure. Undoing that didn't make me harsh. It made me present. There were still quiet moments when I thought about him. Not the man he'd become, but the boy he'd once been. Those thoughts came without invitation and left without resistance. I let them pass. Grief doesn't need a stage when you acknowledge it privately. I didn't rewrite history to make myself feel better. I didn't villainize him to justify my choices. I accepted the complexity of it all. Love had existed. Effort had existed. So had failure, on both sides. What mattered was that the pattern had ended. The long-term consequences of that ending continued to ripple outward. Mutual connections adjusted. Some drifted away, uncomfortable with the lack of reconciliation. Others stayed, appreciating the calm honesty I now brought into conversations. I didn't chase anyone. I didn't explain myself. The people who belonged in this chapter found their way in naturally. Financially, my life stabilized into something predictable and sustainable. No surprise expenses. No last-minute rescues. My resources worked for me instead of disappearing into someone else's lifestyle. That stability wasn't just monetary. It was psychological. I stopped living in anticipation of disaster. That shift changed how I related to money entirely. It became a tool again, not a leash. Something that supported my choices rather than dictated them. I also noticed how much quieter my inner world had become. The constant low-level vigilance, the sense that something might go wrong at any moment, was gone. I wasn't waiting for a call. I wasn't scanning for signs of trouble. My nervous system finally stood down. That kind of peace is difficult to describe to someone who hasn't lived without it. I spent more time outdoors, took longer walks, sat in cafes without checking my phone every few minutes. The present moment stopped feeling like a temporary state between obligations and became something I could actually inhabit. Occasionally, news reached me indirectly. He'd moved again, changed jobs, fallen out with someone else. Each update arrived stripped of emotional charge. It was information without gravity. I understood then that the long-term aftermath wasn't about punishment or lesson teaching. It was about reality asserting itself once artificial support was removed. I hadn't orchestrated his difficulties. I'd simply stopped preventing them. That distinction mattered to me. One evening, as I organized a bookshelf, I came across a tin of photographs I'd brought with me when I first moved in with him. I opened it and spread the pictures out on the table. Images of a younger version of us. Smiles that felt genuine. Moments that had once meant something. I looked at them without nostalgia, without anger, without longing. They were records, not obligations. I returned them to the tin, closed the lid, and placed it back on the shelf. I didn't need to discard them, to move forward. I just needed to know where they belonged. In the past. The most telling sign that everything had truly shifted came when I stopped rehearsing explanations in my head. I no longer imagined conversations where I justified my choices or defended my boundaries. Those mental loops had fallen away, leaving space for thought that served me instead of preparing me for conflict. That's when I knew the silence was irreversible. Not because he wouldn't try again, people like him always consider it, but because even if he did, it would land on ground that no longer moved. I had built something solid. The world didn't end because I chose myself. No bridges collapsed. No cosmic punishment arrived. The sky didn't fall. What did happen was far quieter and far more profound. My life became mine. And once you experience a kind of ownership, you don't give it up. Not for guilt, not for history, not even for blood. The silence held through another year. Then another. It grew so familiar that it stopped registering as silence at all. It was simply the background of my life, like steady air or constant light. And in that steady environment, I thrived, not dramatically, not publicly, but authentically. That, more than anything else, was a consequence he never anticipated. Time doesn't announce when it's finished teaching you something. It simply keeps going until one day you realize the lesson has been absorbed so completely that you no longer recognize the person you were before it began. That realization came to me on an ordinary morning. No milestone, no anniversary, just a quiet Tuesday that felt indistinguishable from the one before it. I was standing by the window, coffee cooling in my hand, watching people hurry past below. Each of them wrapped in their own obligations, their own tensions, their own unfinished business. And for the first time, I noticed something that stopped me cold. I wasn't carrying anything unresolved. No loose ends tugging at my thoughts. No conversations waiting to happen. No decisions postponed out of fear. The silence had done its work. I used to think silence was passive, that it meant avoidance or withdrawal. But I learned it can be active, intentional, strategic, in the most human way possible. Silence, when chosen deliberately, forces truth to surface without interference. And the truth that surfaced in me was simple. I had rebuilt a life that no longer needed correction. The long-term consequences I'd once wondered about had fully materialized by then, not as a dramatic collapse on a side, but as a narrowing, a gradual shrinking of options. When you live without accountability, your world eventually contracts to the size of what you can sustain alone. I didn't need updates anymore to know that. I could feel it in the way his name stopped appearing entirely. Not whispered, not hinted at, not even used as a cautionary tale. He had faded into the background of other people's lives the same way he had faded out of mine. That kind of disappearance isn't punishment. It's irrelevance. I didn't celebrate that. I acknowledge it the way you acknowledge weather patterns. Something that happens when conditions are right or wrong. In my own life, the conditions had shifted permanently. I had built habits that supported me instead of draining me. Mornings that began without bracing. Evenings that ended without replaying. I had learned how to sit with myself without needing distraction, which was something I'd never mastered before. There was always someone else's urgency to attend to, someone else's discomfort to smooth over. That era was gone. I started saying no more often, and yes, only when it felt clean. I noticed how many people confused access with entitlement, and how easily those assumptions dissolve when I stopped reinforcing them. Boundaries, I learned, don't require enforcement when they're consistent. People either adjust or remove themselves. Both outcomes were acceptable. I became more selective about who I let close. Not guarded, just intentional. I didn't need a large circle anymore. I needed a stable one. The kind of people who didn't ask for explanations because they respected decisions. There were moments when someone new would ask about my family. Those questions are inevitable. I answered simply, I'm on my own. I didn't say it with bitterness. I didn't say it defensively. I said it as a fact. Most people accepted it without digging further. The ones who pressed usually revealed more about themselves than about me. I learned to recognize that too. As time went on, my memories of the conflict lost their sharp edges. The details blurred. The emotions softened. What remained wasn't anger or sadness. It was understanding. understanding that relationships don't fail all at once. They erode slowly through patterns that go unchallenged for too long. That understanding didn't make me want to fix anything retroactively. It made me more attentive moving forward. I found myself mentoring younger people occasionally, not in a formal way, but through conversations that unfolded naturally. They'd talk about difficult family dynamics, about feeling trapped by expectations they didn't choose. I didn't offer advice unless asked. When I did speak, I spoke carefully. Pay attention to how people treat your boundaries. I'd say, that tells you everything. I never told my full story. I didn't need to. The lesson mattered more than the details. One afternoon, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. I let it go to voicemail out of habit, then listened later out of curiosity. It was him. The voice was different. Not confrontational. Not pleading. Just tired. He didn't ask for help. He didn't apologize. He didn't even ask to talk. He simply said he wanted me to know he understood now, at least a little, what he'd lost. I sat with that message longer than I expected. Not because it reopened anything, but because it confirmed something I'd already accepted. Insight arrived for him only after consequence had done its work. That's how it often goes. I didn't return the call. That wasn't cruelty. It was consistency. Reopening contact at that point wouldn't have served either of us. Whatever understanding he'd reached needed to stand on its own without my validation or involvement. Growth that depends on someone else's response isn't growth. It's negotiation. I chose not to negotiate. After that, the contact stopped completely. No more messages. No more indirect inquiries. The final thread dissolved quietly, the way it should have long ago. My life continued, steady and unremarkable in the best way possible. I took trips when I wanted, stayed home when I didn't. I invested in experiences rather than obligations. I built days that didn't require recovery afterward. I noticed how differently my body felt in this new rhythm. Less tension, fewer headaches, better sleep. It's remarkable how clearly the body registers freedom once the mind catches up. I also noticed something else, something subtler. I had stopped narrating my life to myself. There was no internal audience anymore. No one I was trying to justify things to. No imaginary conversations playing out in my head. My thoughts moved forward instead of looping back. That silence, the internal one, was the real gift. As years passed, the story of what happened became something other people remembered more vividly than I did. Occasionally, someone would mention it as an example, a caution, a dramatic anecdote. I listened politely, then moved on. It wasn't my story anymore. It had served its purpose. What mattered was a life that had grown in its absence. A life defined not by reaction, but by choice. Not by endurance, but by alignment. I didn't feel hardened by what I'd lived through. If anything, I felt clearer, more capable of generosity, because it was no longer automatic or expected. I could give when it felt right, without fear of being consumed. That distinction changed everything. Sometimes late at night, I'd sit with a book and think about how close I'd come to accepting a diminished version of myself as permanent. How easy it would have been to stay quiet, stay small, stay useful until there was nothing left to give. I felt gratitude, not for the pain, but for the moment it forced me to act. That barbecue, that sentence, that look, they had been the trigger, not the cause. The cause had been years of patience misread as permission. The ending, however, was entirely mine. By the time I realized the story was nearing its natural conclusion, there was nothing left to resolve. No loose threads. No unanswered questions that mattered. The silence had proven itself irreversible, not because contact was impossible, but because it was unnecessary. And necessity, I learned, is the only reason people endure what diminishes them. When that reason disappears, so does the endurance. What remained was a life lived forward, quietly, deliberately, and without apology. And that, more than any confrontation or explanation, was the final outcome. The final understanding didn't arrive with drama. There was no sudden revelation, no closing argument delivered to an empty room. It arrived the way most permanent truths do, quietly, without asking for attention, settling in so naturally that it felt like it had always been there. I was sitting alone one evening. Long after the city outside had slowed to its nighttime rhythm. The lights were low. The room was calm. Nothing remarkable about the moment itself. And yet, as I looked around at the furniture I'd chosen, the books I'd read and reread, the simple order I'd built, I realized something unmistakable. I wasn't waiting for anything anymore. Not an apology. Not acknowledgement. Not understanding. The waiting had ended without me noticing. For a long time after everything happened, I assumed there would be a final emotional checkpoint, a moment where I would feel something definitive. Closure, relief, grief, even triumph. Instead, what I found was far more subtle and far more enduring. Acceptance. Not the kind that resigns itself to loss, but the kind that understands reality without arguing with it. I accepted that my son and I would not share the future I once imagined. Not holidays together. Not quiet conversations over coffee. Not the slow, mutual understanding that sometimes comes with age. That picture had existed only because I'd held it in place, not because it was supported by the present. Letting go of that imagined future hurt far less than continuing to chase it would have. That acceptance did something unexpected. It freed me from rewriting the past. I didn't need to justify my choices anymore, not even to myself. The story was complete as it was. No edits required. The silence that followed didn't feel empty. It felt settled. I noticed it in the smallest details. In how I made decisions now without hesitation. In how I no longer scanned my surroundings for emotional threats. In how my reactions slowed down, becoming measured instead of reflexive. I wasn't guarding myself. I was simply no longer exposed. I began to understand that the conflict hadn't been about disrespect alone. It had been about erasure, about being slowly reduced to a function rather than a person. And the day I stopped playing that role without explanation, without apology, the system that depended on it collapsed. Not explosively. Inevitably, the consequences continued unfolding on his side, but by then they had lost their relevance to me. I didn't track them. I didn't compare. I didn't measure my peace against his struggle. His life was his to navigate now, just as mine was mine. That distinction mattered more than anything else. One morning, while walking through a quiet neighborhood, I passed a father and son arguing loudly on a front lawn. The words weren't clear, but the tension was unmistakable. I slowed my pace instinctively, then stopped myself. Their story wasn't mine. I didn't need to absorb it. That was another change. I no longer internalized other people's chaos. I kept moving, feeling something like gratitude, not for what I'd lost, but for what I'd learned. That boundaries don't have to be announced to be effective. That silence, when chosen consciously, speaks louder than confrontation ever could. That dignity doesn't require an audience. Over time, my life filled itself naturally, not with noise, but with meaning. Conversations that were mutual. Relationships that didn't rely on leverage. Days that ended without exhaustion. I didn't become harder. I became clearer. I could still care, still empathize, still offer support when it was asked for honestly and received with respect. The difference was that now I knew when to stop. I knew when caring crossed into self-neglect. That line had once been invisible to me. Now it was unmistakable. I sometimes wonder how things might have unfolded if I'd drawn that line earlier, if I'd refused the small dismissals, if I'd challenged the subtle control. But those thoughts never lingered. Regret only has power when you believe the past was fixable. I knew now that it had been inevitable given who I was then. Growth happens when it happens. And when it does, it doesn't ask permission from anyone else involved. The house I live in now is quieter than the one before, not just physically, but emotionally. Every object has a purpose. Every room feels lived in rather than defended. There's no tension in the air, no sense that I need to justify my presence or explain my choices. I belong here. That feeling, belonging to your own life, is something no one can give you. It can only be claimed. I claimed it the day I chose not to argue, the day I chose not to explain, the day I chose not to participate in my own diminishment. Everything after that was simply confirmation. I don't tell this story because I want sympathy. I don't tell it because I want validation. I tell it because there are people living quietly inside similar situations, telling themselves it's not that bad, that patience will eventually be rewarded, that silence is the same as peace. It isn't. Peace is active. Peace is chosen. Peace is what remains when you stop negotiating your worth. I don't know where my son is now. Not really. I know he's alive. I know he's making his way through the consequences of his choices, just as I am through the consequences of mine. That's enough information. We don't need to intersect for our lives to continue. The story didn't end with reconciliation. It didn't end with forgiveness spoken out loud. It ended with something quieter and far more powerful. Independence. The money he accused me of wasting is still here. It pays for warmth, stability, and choice. It supports a life that answers only to my values, not someone else's demands. It reminds me every day that what I reclaimed wasn't just financial. It was personal. I didn't walk away angry. I walked away awake. And once you see clearly, you can't unsee it. You can't return to shrinking yourself to make others comfortable. You can't pretend disrespect is harmless. You can't keep offering access to someone who mistakes it for entitlement. The silence remains, not as punishment, as proof. Proof that I can live fully without explaining myself. Proof that dignity doesn't require agreement. Proof that the strongest boundary is the one you never cross again. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt quietly erased, underestimated, or taken for granted, remember this. You don't need permission to reclaim your life. Sometimes the most powerful move isn't what you say or do in the heat of the moment. It's what you stop doing altogether. And before you go, do me a small favor. If my story spoke to you, stay connected, subscribe, share where you're listening from, and pass it along. Stories like this reach the people who need them most when they're shared quietly, one listener at a time.